So now it is our great pleasure to introduce our first provocation speaker, Christina Moon. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. Christina Moon is Associate Professor of Fashion Studies at Parsons School of Design in New York, and her research looks at the social ties and cultural encounters between design worlds and manufacturing landscapes across Asia and the Americas, exploring the memory, migration, and labor of cultural workers. Christina Moon writes incredibly beautiful on fashion, design, and labor, material culture, social memory, the ephemeral and everyday, and ways of knowing and representing in ethnographic practice. Her writings can make you cry for their sheer beauty and political poignancy. Her most recent book project is Ephemera in collaboration with the photographer Lauren Lancaster, which traces fast fashion across Los Angeles, Seoul, and New York. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here. Many thanks to Renata and Francisca for giving me this opportunity and to share this space with you. When I wrote this, I had my own teachers and my students in mind. Students who've been my teachers all along, especially in this past year. And I don't know where to begin because there's just actually too much to say. So rather than a beginning, middle, or end, let me try to describe a moment, a feeling. We have all shared our lockdown stories, but now I will share mine. It is March 10th, 2020. I have a day full of meetings. Wrapping things up, I'm looking forward to the train ride home, out of the city, an hour ride north up the Hudson River, through river towns to my home in the woods. Things have been tough and strange lately. My students from Asia, my Asian American students, are especially hesitant to come to class. With many weeks now with news of the virus, they're afraid of what they've heard from abroad. For many weeks now, they've become fearful of the things they've heard on their walk to the subway, to school, on their way home. Get away from me. Don't bring your virus here. I meet with my thesis students at the end of the day. We share a coffee and they're here to say goodbye indefinitely. I was in disbelief. I thought I'd see them the next day. They weren't so sure if it was okay to hug each other goodbye. The train station was unusually packed that day. We hadn't yet started to wear masks. That night, I got news from the university telling us not to come back to school. Then the following weeks of anguish, news of the numbers of dead rising each day, the governor of New York reporting numbers that would exceed the numbers on 9/11. We quickly learned to teach online. My classes now had the blaring sound of ambulances in the background. Loud all day long. These classes, which we continue to have, were awash in all kinds of grief. We were not only grieving our city, its people we loved or knew. By summer, our meetings had now begun with moments of silence for George Floyd, whose last words breathed life into the memory of all the other Black American lives lost at the hands of police. Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice at 12 years old, Michael Brown, Eric Garner. Black lives who my students routinely protested for over the span of my 10-year Parsons teaching career. So when you log into your classroom and you see your students, faces of all kinds and of all walks of life staring back at you, young faces who are exhausted from being too afraid to walk outside for fear of a virus or a racial slur, tired from days of protesting out in the streets for Black lives, worried because they've lost their jobs or their parents have lost jobs, or they've lost parents or grandparents to this virus for that matter, or stuck in the city since flights are canceled or suspended, isolated and alone without their families, anxious from all the everyday unknowns. Young faces who witness firsthand how the most vulnerable pay the highest toll in the wealthiest city on earth. The blaring ambulances outside, the protests for justice on the street, some of them sick with COVID themselves. then a classroom, even online, becomes a place to take refuge, a place of rest where we might catch our breath, to comfort and console each other from all the challenges of our everyday worlds. Here, when we listen and listen closely, we can find ourselves inside the story. We are no longer our single self. Rather, in the story, we are everyone it concerns. In this classroom, we can find our footing, understand the nature of our predicament, acknowledge the inequity, and can openly name that which has hurt us or hurt others. And together, we can make the critique, a counter to the hegemonic narrative that tells us subtly and directly in the lived myriad moments of our everyday that we are dominated, that the essence of us is marginal, that we don't exist or are invisible, that we don't belong. We can, as Bell Hooks teaches us, move away from defining ourselves in reaction to the racisms, the hierarchies, these forms of domination, and move more towards practices of freedom, where we forge identities that resist and transcend such narrowly given limits. Fashion education is a classroom as refuge, with so many resources already among us, the imaginative individuals who've shown up for each other, our partial and limited perspectives, yet read from such different locations of experience and interpretation. Our different wisdoms, lineages, traditions, our different ways of knowing the world. In this shared space, we become something in relation to each other. We share our life and our many different realities. I learned all this from my own beloved teachers, who made a classroom as refuge for me, a place for understanding, a realm for self-recovery, a place to discover where my spirit might dwell. I had suffered my own personal losses this past year too. Kids who are now home, learning through computer screens, no longer able to see their friends. Myself, cut off from a city I love, the people I love, cut off from all my daily routines. My dearest teacher, my mentor, my good friend, the virus had taken him too. My parents' hardware store, open for 30 years, shut down for good, like all the other stores on Main Street. In quarantine and on the phone, my father's begun to speak to me through the confused fog of his dementia, an 85-year-old memory. This mashed up collage of colonial language, his repressed mother tongue, the accent of a tough northern industrial New Jersey. He is 6 years old again, singing an anthem and saluting the sun. He tells me how cold his hands are on his walk to school, because the emperor and his teachers required his pockets to be sewn closed. What is a fashion education? It's a study on pockets, their structure and form, but more meaningfully for me, how they're meant to be open, to warm and comfort small hands in the cold winter of empire. Pockets of belonging for the authors, thinkers, artists, laborers, who are the immigrants and exiles that have found a home on my syllabus, along with students who have, each one of them, left behind someone else's image of who they are and what they should be to make their way to school. They too have crossed so many borders and barriers in thought and life experiences to escape the confines and conformity of wherever they're from, to find small pockets of freedom, invent new mother tongues, express themselves in a billion different ways through the beauty of their art and cultural forms. So that when they watch the film The Last Train Home by Li Xinfan, and watch a restless and rebellious teenager resent her parents' absence having to work in faraway garment factories, she herself longing for freedom away from school and her rural hometown, they understand how we are connected to her and to them. Or they might recognize the familiar faint smell of fresh laundered clothes, the lavender and lilac in the softeners, worn by the bullies in Ocean Vuong's novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, as a powerfully poetic critique of the unjust, fetid smell of white violence as entertainment in American masculinity. Students might consider the logoed backpacks that carry their iPads as the same ones carried by those crossing the Sonoran Desert on the US-Mexico border, bearing photos of loved ones, prayer beads, talismans and tokens for survival, the ephemera that too often lasts longer than its owners. Or they might feel themselves in Mabel Hampton, resurrected by the writer and historian Saidiya Hartman, who dances away in the chorus lines and cabarets of 1920s Harlem, from scanty corset on stage, to men's trousers and Panama hats with her lady lovers, to the domestic worker's uniform worn at the end of her life. Hartman shows Mabel's radical art of subsistence, her transfiguration of the given, her refined skill of refusing the world that refused her. She offers us another definition for beauty, writing, "Beauty is not a luxury, rather a way of creating possibility in the space of enclosure." Our students want to see themselves in this education, encountering stories, resemblances of our faces, their lives and struggles, the traces of history that bear upon our lives, as we search for a way to remake the world as something different, something beautiful and experimental. They hunger for examples like these in the archive, in the paintings and photos, and gallery walls, down the runway, in the studio, adorning the body as something valid and worthy. They want knowledge that cares for the soul, that shows how one might live, cope, take care, resist, bloom, find sanctuary and solitude. I see these practices of making fashion, of making art, as practices that settle the soul, restore our senses, recuperate memory, make sense of our struggles, conjure ourselves into being, and enter history without literacy or words. Remember child's play, the renewal of existence, and children do in 100 unfailing ways: painting, cutting, pasting, sewing, collecting, touching, giving things new names. Take the riches of the past, place them in a new set of relations, access and encounter an imagination set free. This my teachers once told me too, that the real history of the world is understood through its most powerful art and cultural forms, which were not made by leaders or elites, but rather from average and ordinary working people who, with the least artistic resources, made refuge, found ways to make joy and make home for themselves in such a contingent and conditional world. When I listen and listen closely, I hear my students ask me, "Can you see me as I see myself?" Take refuge because you need the time and space to lose yourself in a beautiful poem, in the colors of textiles, in the meditative practice of making. Let the thoughts come in and out, then leave you. Take refuge by getting up and taking a stretch, because your body has been holding so much, because we need the hopeful, joyful, and pleasurable to counter the boredom, our apathy, the cynicism and despair. I need this refuge too, to hang up the dirty laundry, air out my diasporic longing, my racial melancholia, my frontumalia or malaise, to touch the maum, the spirit heart, mind heart of belonging. My student Hien said to me just the other day that her fashion practice, her making of art, it's a form of healing, a mending of her heart as much as her humanity. Wow, I am so moved. Could this not be important for our lives? Thank you, everyone.